Welcome to the Money Maven Project podcast. If you're here to learn how to obtain freedom over your time and money through real estate investing, you're in the right place. Create the life you want by living with intention and becoming a Maven in mindset, money, and real estate. Now, here's your host, Justin Monk.
Hey, this is Justin Monk with the Money Maven Project podcast. I am super excited this afternoon. We got Leonard with us here. I'm super excited to hear your story. I bumped into you on Instagram. I'm like, hey, this guy would actually probably be worth having a chat with. So go ahead and introduce yourself, kind of tell us your story, how you got into real estate investing and where you're at today.
Thanks so much for having me, Justin. I appreciate it. Excited to be here. My story, I go back pretty far in terms of timeline because I think it's important for my story. And I think it also helps me stand out a little bit from your typical investor that you hear on a podcast. So I actually had no plans of ever going to college or ever investing. I had no real interest in money or anything like that. I actually started racing motocross when I was 4 years old, and I had just ended up getting pretty good at it. My dad and I ended up traveling the country, and I ended up being ranked number 2 in the world for my age group. And the best way that I could describe it is, think of professional sports and you have your minor leagues. You kind of have these up and coming athletes that you expect to take over the next generation of professional sports. That's kind of where I was at when I was about 14 years old in the motocross world.
Wow.
And so I never planned on going to college. Nobody in my family ever went to college. Nobody in my family has ever made any type of investment in their lives. So that wasn't a path that was paved for me. My plan was to go be a professional motocross racer. And that was very real. I've been sponsored by some of the biggest companies in the industry. And so I didn't really have a backup plan. I was about a year away from going professional when somebody close to our family passed away racing motocross. And so that hit my dad really hard because the individual was about my age. Mm-hmm. I didn't know them super, super well, but my dad was pretty good friends with their dad. And so it hit my dad really hard, and he just could never imagine that happening to his kid, of course. And so basically from that moment, I didn't step foot on a bike again for about 12 years. Wow. And so I had to figure something out. I was 14 years old. I was about a freshman in high school or so, and I had to figure something out. And I had always excelled in math. I had always done really well, and that was always my strongest suit. And I always liked money. I thought it was interesting. So I said, well, why don't I combine these two things, money and math? And that's where I came into finance. And that's how I started to get interested in stock investing, ended up falling in love with Warren Buffett and everything that he teaches. And that eventually led to investing in real estate and everything else that I have going on today.
Yeah, perfect. I love that. Yeah, that definitely is a different story than what you usually hear, right? Usually it's somebody reads Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and then they start real estate investing. So yeah,
fun fact, not a huge fan of Rich Dad, Poor Dad myself personally.
That would be a whole nother podcast to get to dissect that. That would be a good conversation, because I don't know if I've ever heard anybody that wasn't a big fan of it. So but let's talk to us a little bit more about, so you went into finance. When did the light kind of come on that real estate was where you wanted to put some effort and kind of put some focus, and why?
So when I decided to go into college, my dream was to work at a hedge fund. My biggest passion was stock investing, and that was kind of the pinnacle of stock investing, was to work at a hedge fund. And so I studied that. I ended up going through the whole program, getting my MBA, got a couple other accounting licenses similar to a CPA. And so that was my dream. Ended up not being able to work at a hedge fund. I just couldn't get a position there. It's very cutthroat, and I just wasn't able to make that happen.
Yeah.
But when I was going into college, my father told me that when I graduated, if I was still living at home, I would have to start paying him rent. And I didn't think that was really unrealistic. I thought that was pretty normal or fair. If I'm earning a salary, it's only fair that I pay him a little bit of rent to live in his house and eat his food and use his utilities.
Yeah.
So, but I didn't like that idea. I didn't want to do it. I didn't think it was unreasonable. I just didn't want to do it. And so I'm 18 years old. I'm a freshman in college. And I told my dad, I said, listen, I understand where you're coming from, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to buy a house while I'm in college so that I don't have to pay you rent when I graduate. And he didn't buy his first house till he was in his 40s. Nobody else in my family had ever owned a house. None of my friends had ever made any investments. So everybody thought I was crazy. And they all just told me I was crazy and it was not possible, and, et cetera, all these reasons why I couldn't do it. Ultimately, fast forward, I ended up buying my first house my senior year of college before I walked at my college graduation. And I bought that house as an alternate to paying rent. I didn't think of it as an investment in any way for real estate. It was literally just a place for me to live. And the reason I hadn't thought of it as an investment was because I never thought that I could be a real estate investor. I was pretty good at stock investing. I understood that really well. I considered that my expertise at the time. And so I always thought that you had to be a millionaire or billionaire to buy real estate. So I figured I'll just make all my money in the stock market first, and then I'll take that money and put it into real estate. And so I had no expectations of that property being an investment. But after living there for a few months, I realized that I never even opened the door for the second bedroom that was in the house. And so I said, well, I should probably rent this out. And so I did. And I rented out that second bedroom for about $700 or $750 a month. And my all-in cost with HOA fees, mortgage, taxes, everything was about $1,100. So I was living for pretty cheap. And 6 months into that, I realized, man, you're just not that smart. Somebody had to have done this before you. And sure enough, I ended up stumbling onto house hacking and millions of other people that are real estate investors that are no different than me. That totally just shattered all of the limiting beliefs I had. Yeah. And from there, it's kind of history.
That's awesome. So you house hack this first property, kind of stumble into it, and then you see what's out there and what other people are doing. Where did you kind of go after this house hack? What was the strategy in acquiring the next properties?
So after I house hacked that first property, I house hacked my second property as well. It falls under the category of house hack, but it was more so live and flip. So I found a property that it was livable, absolutely, and it was totally fine as it was. But I knew there's a couple of small things that I could do to the property that would increase the value. Yeah. And so I sold my other house and purchased this one, lived in it for about 2 years, made some small renovations myself, and kind of just did a live and flip.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. And then, so you live in that one, you flip it, but you kept living in it for a little bit. And what's the strategy? What did the strategy go to? What are you kind of currently focused on?
So from there, I ended up, while I lived there, I bought my first traditional rental, the regular, rental that people talk about. And then I also sold the live and flip that I was in, and I purchased another house hack. This is my third one. I live in it currently. It's a duplex. I live in one unit, rent out the other. And then I've also scaled my traditional rental portfolio to 4 or 5 traditional rentals, excluding the rental unit that I have at the house I live in.
Yeah, and the 4 or 5 traditional rental units, are they in your local market? They out of state? Where are they at?
They are out of state. So I invest out of state exclusively. I don't do any traditional rental purchasing in my local area.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I want to come back to that, because that's the investing long distance. That's a whole other topic. And I want to dive into that, because I did the same thing. I live in northern Utah. The market's ridiculous here. Like a 3-bed, 2-bath is like an easy 150 to 175, where I can buy the same type property in Ohio for 50 grand or whatever. So I made some moves to start investing long distance. So I want to come back to that topic, but before we go there, how were you funding these deals, these house hacks, initially, or even the live and flip?
They were all funded with my own capital, my own money. And the first one was a 3.5% down. It wasn't FHA. I actually went conventional for my first ever mortgage, but it was 3.5% down, maybe 5%. I forget it exactly, but it was very small. And I actually negotiated a seller credit on that first property. And so I only had to bring like $10,000 to the table for the first one. Ended up making a little bit of a profit on that. rolled that into the live and flip. And again, that was another 5% down. So, and I also negotiated a seller credit on that one. So I forget the exact dollar amount in terms of what I had to bring to the table for that one. I think it was around 11 or 12,000. So it wasn't a ton of money for that one either. And then even my most recent house hack was about a $400,000 property. But I got creative and I used a seller credit and I was able to buy this property for about $12,000 in cash. I should have had to bring about $22,000 with closing costs, down payment, everything included. But I negotiated a $10,000 seller credit. So I only had to bring $12,000 out of pocket myself. And then all of my long distance rentals, I purchased them with my business partner, Ryan. He and I just split it 50-50 for all of those.
And yeah. So using your own capital, but going into those with a partner.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And some of those have been traditional purchases. Some of them have been BRRRR. So it kind of depends on how much capital we've had to put in. But yeah, we always split it 50-50.
Yeah. And those initial homes that you house hacked, where were you finding those deals?
Every property I've ever purchased has been straight off the MLS.
That's awesome. Because people say that there's nothing on the MLS right now.
Yeah, everybody says that. And it's kind of crazy because I sold my property that I lived in for about $30,000 over asking. And then I purchased the one I live in now for about $20,000 under asking. So deals are out there and those are both on and off on the MLS. So it's definitely possible.
Yeah. And all the deals that I've bought in Ohio have been off of the MLS too. It's definitely getting tighter. It's getting a little bit tougher to find them, a little bit hard, not as many opportunities there, but I've picked them all up on the MLS so far. So it's, there's definitely deals out there. So what would you say, would you recommend house hacking for somebody that's trying to get into real estate? Maybe they don't have a ton of capital or access to private money. Is house hacking something that you would recommend to them?
Yeah, I think for anybody that's getting started in real estate, I think number one best strategy that's possible for you is house hacking for various reasons. One, you typically have to bring less money to the table. But two, some people call it landlording light. Some people call it landlording with training wheels. Whatever your analogy is, it allows you to be a landlord without all of the complications that come of it. So it allows you to kind of test it out before you really jump into the deep end. And I think that is super valuable.
Yeah. And because a lot of people, when they're getting started, they don't have a ton of capital. So a lot of people opt to go into flipping or even, probably more so like wholesaling, some quick cash. They can find a deal, they can wholesale, get some money built up. And I go back and forth between recommending those two strategies. I think house hacking is if you're like married and have 4 kids, it might be a little bit more tricky. But if you're single or newly married and you can, 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment works for you, then house hacking is a dang good place to start. Because like you said, very minimal capital up front to get into the deal. And you wholesale a couple of deals and you've got your down payment for a 4-plex or whatever to house hack multifamily and get into the property. If you buy a discounted property, one that's distressed, and put some money into it. I know there's is it like the 203K loan or something to help finance some of the rehab costs. Like there's so much opportunity if you're going to live in the property. And it's an easy way to get into some appreciation, some cash flow, and to get some doors under your belt. So I definitely recommend that. What are some tips? Go ahead.
You're right that if you have a family and 4 kids, it's probably a little bit more difficult, but I think it's still absolutely possible. I think it's more about having the right personality or the right approach to be able to do that, because I live in a duplex right now, and the house really that I live in is not much different than if I had bought a single family house. I just have somebody that lives next door. That's it. I mean, it's really no different than if I had bought a single family house, other than I have to manage the tenant on the other side. But it's really, other than that, I would have no idea that I live next to somebody. I never see them. They never bother me or anything like that. So and sure, there's so many different types of properties you can buy. You can buy one where if you're up and down, that's sometimes more difficult for a family because you have people above you or below you. And sometimes that's more of like an apartment feel.
Yeah.
You have to deal with some sound, or you're constrained to one level. Whereas if you buy a townhouse style, which is multiple levels, I mean, I have a full basement, a yard, everything. It's almost like you have a single family house, yet you have somebody covering your mortgage. So maybe it's a little bit more difficult, but I would argue that for the right person, the right personality, if they have a strong enough goal and why they're doing what they're doing, I think house hacking can work for anybody.
Yeah. What are some tips you'd give to somebody that's, like I said, like getting into real estate and they're starting to look into some opportunities for house hacking? What are some first steps for them, I guess, if you can briefly?
For house hacking, I would say the most important thing is understand your exit strategy, because I think too many people run the numbers for when they live there. But what happens when you don't live there? And if you're going to sell when you leave, then that's fine. I mean, I guess you don't really have to worry too much about rentals numbers when you leave. But one of the biggest benefits of house hacking is that when you're able to buy that rental property for 5% down and then leave after a year, if you would like, or whenever, and now you've owned that rental property for 5% down, which is a great way to get into rental properties. Yeah, but the problem is a lot of people want to do that. They're going to end up renting it out when they leave, but they don't run the numbers on the back half for when they do leave and see what the returns are going to be like and make sure it's actually satisfactory for what they want.
Yeah.
So a big piece is if you are going to rent it out when you leave, make sure you're aware of what those numbers will be when you leave and make sure it's a good deal before you buy it.
Yeah. So give us an example of like kind of your rules of thumb for what the numbers need to be once you move out of the place.
Everybody is different.
If you have rules of thumb on those, yeah.
Yeah, everybody's different on that. It depends what you're okay with. So for me, I look at it just as if I hadn't lived there. What I compare it to my traditional rental benchmarks, because that's what it's becoming. When you leave, it's becoming a traditional rental. So I look to my traditional rental investing benchmarks, which is typically around 20% cash on cash, which is usually really easy to hit with a house hacking deal because you're putting so little capital in. And then usually my goal is $200 a month in cash flow per door. And typically that's usually possible with a house hack as long as you're buying it right.
Yeah. So what would you say to somebody that's like, you know, they see the value in real estate, they want to get in, they understand that it's got so much potential, but they're just like, I just don't think I can do it, or it's just, I don't know how to do it. There's too many obstacles for me. Like, what would you say to somebody that maybe doesn't think it's for them or that they can do it?
If they don't think they can do it, then I would argue they haven't read enough or studied enough, because all you have to do is look at all the people that are doing it and you'll realize quickly that there are thousands and thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the US doing exactly what you think you can't do.
Yeah.
And they are no different than you. I started doing this when I was 21 years old. I had come from a blue collar family. I grew up in a mobile home park, first one in my family to ever go to college, paid my way through myself. You know, if I can do it, anybody can do it.
Yeah. Well, it's so easy. Like nowadays, it's so easy to see that other people are doing it from books. I mean, books have kind of always been around, but now you've got social media, you've got podcasts. You know, for me, the Bigger Pockets podcast was I learned a lot there, but what I really got out of those kinds of podcasts was, hey, this guy can do it or this girl can do it. So can I. And so day to day, like as I consumed that content, I was just encouraged that to keep pushing, to keep learning, to keep figuring it out, because if they can do it, I can do it. And like you said, there's thousands of people all across from all different levels, like from 21 years old to 51 years old, trying to, expedite or make his retirement more comfortable or whatever. Like tons of different walks of life, I guess, or stages of life are getting into real estate and succeeding. And so there's no reason that you can't do this. There's so many ways to get in. There's so many paths to get in, whether it's wholesaling or house hacking, partnering with somebody. I mean, there's a way to get it done. And I would challenge everybody that's thinking that way to challenge the assumptions that you're making of why you don't think you can get in, because they're just that. They're assumptions, and they're probably imaginary roadblocks that you can get around for sure. What are some common things that you see that keep people from getting into real estate or getting their first deal?
Number one thing is thinking that they don't have enough money. Everybody that's getting into real estate that hasn't done a deal there, they say that they don't have enough money. And I understand that. There is a lot of people that probably don't have enough money. But if you get creative, I think you can buy a deal. I bought my first house for $10,000. And I understand, listen, that's a lot of money, but it's not, I mean, most people, if you're really hungry and you really want to buy your first real estate deal, you can probably come up with $10,000 at some point to be able to buy that property. Now, we're not talking $50,000, $100,000. And this stems from my biggest belief is that people don't know how to analyze deals. And because they don't know how to analyze deals, they don't know what it takes to actually get into that deal. And so they have this misconception that they need $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 to buy a property. A lot of people think you need 20% down if you're going to buy an investment property. So that's the biggest limiting belief that I think people have is they think they don't have enough money. And I argue that you can get into a deal for as little as, I've purchased deals for $0 down. So you could get in for as $0 down. I don't think that's necessarily realistic for your first deal. So I don't pitch that to brand new investors. I don't want to set your expectations at that. But I think it's very, very possible for you to get your first deal off the MLS, a typical no hassle deal for $10,000 or maybe slightly less if you can get creative.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was in the same boat. Like initially when I started to explore real estate, we owned a townhome that we lived in for a while, and then we moved out and we rented that townhome out. And so I'm like, okay, let's go find the next property. And just like everybody, probably when they first start looking at it, they're like, well, okay, it's an investment property. So now the bank wants me to come up with 20 or 25% down. And then I started doing the math. I'm like, well, that's a lot of money, A, and B, how many properties am I going to be able to buy before I run out of money? And I was like, well, maybe one. And then I'm out of money, until I can save up another 20 or 30% down. And so I think that's where a lot of people come from is the first thing they do is they go talk to their bank and they're like, oh, they need that much down. Well, I guess I can't do this. And I think you made a good point. If you don't think you can do it, you haven't read enough. You haven't learned enough because there are so many different methods to get in. Like you just said, with 3.5% down, just less down, zero money down in rare cases. There's different strategies out there. The Burr method obviously is what I went to because I'm like, oh, well, now I can come up with my down payment or buy the house cash and then Burr it out, buy it, rehab it, rent it out, refinance, get my capital back out and do it again. So I won't run out of capital in theory. So that was big for me, seeing that there was a different way to do it when I just thought there was only one way to do it. You had to come up with your 20, 25% down and that was it. Once you learn, those assumed obstacles are just that. They're just assumed, they're imaginary and they start to fall away.
There are ways for anybody to get started. I think the biggest thing, if I can recommend, is learn how to analyze the deal. Then you'll know what the numbers really are and you'll realize that it's not as scary as you think.
Yeah, I agree. So tell us more about the long distance investing, the rentals that you're buying out of state. How did you pick your market and kind of build a team out there, or what, how are you getting that done? Because people hear when I say that I invest in Ohio, they're just like, you do what? Have you seen these properties? And I'm like, no. And they just think I'm absolutely crazy. So how did you pick your market? And then how are you hedging any risks that you perceive or that are potentially out there for long distance real estate investing?
Yeah, everybody that I tell that I invest in Texas and I live in the greater Boston area. Everybody that I tell that to thinks I'm absolutely crazy, just like you. They wonder if I've ever seen it, if I've ever been there, how do I handle all the issues, et cetera, et cetera. And I always tell them I've never been there. And I hope I never have to, because if I do, something seriously went wrong. And so how did I pick the market? I have a podcast that I host, and I had a gentleman on the podcast. His name is Neil Bawa, and he's a data scientist turned real estate investor. So he's very focused on data. Me being an accountant, I really like numbers and data as well. So his strategy really spoke to me. And he basically did a bunch of research and developed these 6 demographic data points that are typically lead to rental market success. course, there's no guarantee, but based on his back testing, these 6 demographic data points have led to great rental markets. And so what I did was I scraped census data off the internet for 7,000 cities across the US, and I analyzed every single city, about 7,000 of them, for these 6 demographic data points. And I created, I don't want to call it proprietary because it's not that fancy, but my own little grading rubric that rates each city based on these 6 different things. And I weighted them based on how important each demographic data point is. And then I gave each city a final grade.
Wow.
Then I went through and I looked at the top, say 25. And I looked at, okay, is there any inventory in this market that I could purchase? And 2, is there anybody there that could actually help me with achieving my goals? Is there anybody, any real estate professionals there? There were a bunch of cities in the top 25 that had professionals, but they had no inventory that I was looking to buy. Or there was just a combination of that didn't exist there. So ultimately ended up narrowing that 25 down to maybe 10 or so. And I believe my business partner and I had offers across like 8 to 10 cities at once. This was all across the US. We had some in Texas, North Carolina, Ohio, Alabama, Idaho. We were all over. And we basically said, we like all of these markets. So whichever one hits first, whichever one we get a deal in first, we will continue to just double down there and we'll focus our efforts there. Just so happens we got our first deal in Texas. It's gone really, really well. And so we just continue to double down and focus on that market.
Wow, that's amazing. Like, so 7,000 cities down to like 10. That's way more scientific than me. I saw somebody investing in Ohio on Instagram and I called them up and I picked their brain. And then I'm like, yeah, let's just do that. Because he was being successful at it. But I'm obviously probably not the data guy or the numbers guy that you are. So everybody has their method, I guess. But I bet there's I have
an interesting piece to that. And this is where I think my stock investing background has actually really helped me. So I typically talk about how I'm a Warren Buffett style real estate investor. And before I get into real estate, like I said, most of my expertise was in stock investing. And I'm not like one of those day traders. I'm not a penny stock guy. Like I buy companies that I plan to own for 5 to 10 years, similar to how Warren Buffett invests. And so one of his principles is investing, and just generally stock market investing advice is to invest in things that you understand, but also that there isn't a lot of competition. So invest in companies where there aren't a lot of people already investing so that there's an opportunity for a mispricing between the underlying asset and the value. And so when I started to look into going long distance, there are markets across the US where there are great professionals already set up, ready to help out-of-state investors because they're so popular for out-of-state investors because the rents versus the property prices are so, there's a great ratio there. So a lot of investors go there. These markets a lot of them are in Ohio. There's 2 or 3 in Ohio. There's Indianapolis, Indy. There's a couple in Alabama. So Memphis, Tennessee. There's a couple in Tennessee as well. And so my business partner and I considered going there, but we said, why are we going to go to these markets where there's already so much competition? We have all this data. We know what cities replicate the quality of these other cities, but there's nobody investing there for the most part, relatively speaking. Why don't we try it? And so that's what we did. We decided to fish where there's not as many fishermen, but still enough fish to catch. And so rather than going into these markets where there's a ton of competition, we chose one that had strong demographic data points similar to these other common out-of-state investing markets and just did it ourselves.
That's so smart. Because it's funny because I have actually been thinking that recently, like because it's super competitive in Ohio, like it's getting ridiculous. And because I've been like, well, maybe because MLS has been getting more difficult to find deals on the MLS. And I'm like, well, okay, well, maybe I'll start direct mailing or, virtually driving for dollars. And I'm like, yeah, but so is everybody else. Like it's going to be so competitive. And yeah, maybe my salesmanship skills on the phone might be better than the other guy or whatever that might get me the deals. But I have a full-time solar sales job. I manage a sales team for a solar company. Like I don't have time to be on the phones all day doing that. So I'm like, well, I just need to find, like you said, like somewhere where it's got the demographics, it's got what I need for an investment, for real estate investing, as far as the market, but it's not on everybody's radar and everybody's top 10 list yet. So I'd like to know.
There's a turnkey company there. It's too competitive for me.
Yeah.
If you look at all those markets, there's turnkey providers in all of them. And that just means it's super common and popular for out-of-state investors. And that's fine. If you want to buy a turnkey property, that's a great option for you. But if you don't, if you're going to do it yourself, I don't see a reason why you're going to go into those markets and compete with all the investors that are already there, and specifically the turnkey providers. They just have scale that you can't match as an individual single investor. So take what those markets already give, find it somewhere else, and invest. And the market that I invest in doesn't have zero competition. There are investors there. It's just a lot less than these other markets because they're not turnkey providers. They're typically not out of state. They typically live there. So the competition is just a lot less than in these other markets. Not non-existent, just less.
Yeah, I don't think there's anywhere that there's gonna be zero competition, but there's definitely places that don't have it as much. Yeah, because I started looking at some of the Memphis. I started looking at other markets. I'm like, Memphis. That's on all the lists. Everybody's hot and bothered about Memphis, and I contacted a few agents down there, and the one agent, it's pretty cool. They send out emails for every deal that comes across their table, and it has they list the ARV, the rent, the quoted rehab or estimated rehab, links to their YouTube video about the zip code and what the neighborhood's like. And I'm like, hey, this is pretty awesome. But I'm like, hey, this means that there's 5,000 people looking at this email. Because I started running the numbers at their asking price. I'm like, hey, for the Burr method to work, I got to leave $10,000 in this deal at that price. And he's like, yeah, people are doing it. And I'm like, well, I'm not super excited about that. I mean, I want to leave maybe $2,000 at the most. I want to get all my money back. And so it's just been a little bit discouraging, or not discouraging, but I'm learning hey, this is getting crazy. And so that's why I'm like, hey, what's the other markets? So I want to know what the other 10 areas are, and then I'll go find those ones.
So I'll give it to you right now. I can't tell you exactly the 10 because I don't know it by heart, but I'll tell you. So what I ended up doing was this was all in an Excel spreadsheet, but I'm a very entrepreneurial guy. And so I said, well, if I need this, then somebody else is going to need it. And so I ended up creating a web platform. And ultimately, I wanted to turn it into an entire startup. I just didn't have time. And so I ended up just uploading all that data into a web platform that anybody can access for free. It's called Wisery, WISEREI.com. I don't make any money from it. I just give it away totally for free. I hope you guys, everybody listening, and you, Justin, enjoy it. Just go into the database and you can search by the Wisery grade, highest to lowest, and you'll see the number one ranked city down to the 7,000th.
That's wisery.com?
Yep. WISEREI.com. WiseRealEstateInvestor.com.
Love that, man. That's awesome. Well, all of our listeners that listen to this episode, they just got their money's worth right there. That'll be cool. Because I think that's the question. As an entrepreneur, you've got to be thinking just a little bit ahead of the race, right? That's where the best opportunity is going to be, is being just out in front of everybody, get into those markets that aren't super competitive while it's easy. Because when I first started in Ohio, I was making offers every week on MLS deals, and they were easy. They weren't, I was getting it for the price I wanted, but now it's everything is going for over asking price, even the stress stuff, the rundown stuff. So it's getting crazy. So I'm looking for a new spot.
Well, I hope that helps. And if you do check it out, I'd love to hear some feedback on what you think.
I definitely will. I'll definitely I'm excited to take a look at that. So what other tips do you have for people investing in rental properties out of state? What kind of a process or team system do you use to get these deals done?
If we're talking rentals in general, whether it be long distance or in your own market, I think the number one piece of advice I give is to start as small as you possibly can. And that goes against a lot of gurus. And I very confidently stand behind that I believe you should start as small as you possibly should. If we're talking specifically long distance investing, the number one thing is having a rock star agent. My business partner and I could not do what we do long distance without having our agent that we have. He's an absolute rock star. He helps us so much, and it just wouldn't be possible without him. So biggest thing for me is to have a great agent. So if you're going between 3 cities or 4 cities or 5 cities and you have a couple deals in each one, and a couple of the cities have better deals than the other, but they have less subpar agents, and the other one you have an amazing agent, but the deal is not as great, I would take the one with the great agent every single time.
Really? That's a good point. That's strong. Give us some characteristics of like what you mean by a rock star agent.
I get asked that a lot, and it's really hard to define, but you just kind of know it when you meet them. And I hate to give that kind of fluffy answer, but you meet them and they first and foremost, they have your best interest at mind.
Yeah.
For me, that's obviously crucial. 2, I personally like that they are an investor themselves. You'll get some people that argue that they don't want them to be an investor because you don't want competition and conflict of interest, etc.
Mm-hmm,
For me, I prefer that they are an investor because, sure, maybe it's competition, but I think more importantly, that also shows me their ethics. And so I want to work with somebody that's ethical. And if they're an investor and they're going to take my deal, I don't want to work with them anyway.
Yeah.
And technology, their ability to work with technology and go above and beyond what is a normal agent. And it's going to be kind of hard to find because there's a lot of agents out there that can just help home buyers. The markets are crazy. All they have to do is submit some offers for them. They don't really have to do a ton of work. And I'm not downplaying being an agent. I know how hard it is, but in terms of what my investor agent does for me compared to a home buyer is significantly easier, and they make the same commission. So you have to find somebody that's willing to put in a little bit of work. And I don't mean this to be ageist in any way, but typically your older agents that are a little bit more experienced are going to probably not be your best choice because they already have a book of business. They've already done so much business and success, and they don't need to go above and beyond for you to reach these levels of success. So for what I've found is to find somebody that's a little bit younger, somebody that's a little bit hungrier. They still need to know what they're doing, but somebody that's a little bit hungrier tends to be able to go above and beyond for you and is a little bit better with technology, which I find to be super helpful when you're investing long distance.
And no, I agree with that 100%. The first agent that we started working with, I think he was like brand new, but he was super hungry because he didn't have a bunch of, easy deals coming at him from, not easy deals, but like, references and people that he was already a big clientele base. So he needed to build his book of business and the people that he's working with. And so he was hustling hard for us, like 11 p.m. at night, whatever, like he's texting us about deals. Cause that's when, again, I work a main gig all day long. So I'm doing my investing stuff early morning and late evening. And so that's when I need the agent to be available to talk about stuff. So yes, he was young. He knew technology. He was super hungry. And that's what ultimately made the difference for us. And anytime he was like uncertain, or I felt like he maybe was uncertain about something, I would say, hey, just check with your broker. You're like, check with, your boss or whatever. And let's just double check, make sure we're doing this right. Because it was also new for me. That was like our starting point too. So we didn't know either. And so, but he had, people that he could go to get the answers that he needed if he was uncertain. And so, but it made the difference because he's like, he wanted any deal regardless. And so he was submitting low offers for us all the time. No questions asked. He did not care. He wanted to get it done. And so I do kind of have a soft spot for those, the younger agents and the newer ones that are hungry to build their pipeline and to get a deal for you. And that was a game changer for us initially, for sure. That's good advice. Good. Anything else on the long distance stuff?
Don't be afraid. Technology has changed. Technology has completely changed how you can invest in real estate long distance. I know it's scary. I know you'll probably get a lot of pushback. When I bought my first property, my family, wants the best for me. And so they're just trying to look out for me. But a lot of people gave me criticism when I bought my first property long distance. And I think it's an old adage. It's decades old that you can't invest long distance in real estate yourself. And I just think technology has completely changed the game.
Well, you said it right at the beginning. Like you said, whether it's long distance or local market, the most important thing is the agent. But I think the point is that it's getting to be more and more the same. Like I would still, even if I was buying a house across the street, I'd still have an inspector go walk through it for me. I'd still have my contractor go check it out. Like I'd still have my team go look at it probably even before I go see it. Maybe I'd go over there just because I can, but ultimately it's the same. It's even whether it's 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away, I'm still going to follow a very similar process. It's just maybe with different team members,
That is 1,000% exactly what I say. The first thing people say to me, well, what happens if the toilet breaks? And I say, well, first off, I'm an accountant. I can't swing a hammer to save my life. I don't know what the heck I'm looking at in the house. So if a toilet breaks, I'm not fixing it. Like I live literally, the wall behind me is another tenant that I have because I live in a duplex. I have a house hack. If that toilet breaks next door, I am not going over there to fix it. I probably won't even go look at it because I don't even know what the heck I'm looking at. So I'm going to call my plumber and my plumber's going to go over there and he's going to take care of it. And it's the same exact thing if it's 2,000 miles away. It doesn't matter. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm looking at. I'm going to rely on the professionals that I know and I've vetted, and they're going to handle the situation for me. And so it's once you're managing it, it's the same thing, but it's even when you're acquiring it in the inspection report. Usually when I go to a walkthrough for a property, it's mostly useless because I have no idea what I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. So I wait, I get the inspection report. I rely on the professional that knows what they're looking at. And then I base my decision on that and I have conversations with them. So it doesn't matter if it's next door or if it's 2,000 miles away. It's exactly what I do.
It's so funny because people just add this level of like, well, what don't you want to see it? I'm like, well, no, not really. Like
why?
I'm not the professional. Like you said, like I need a home inspector with his level to see if the furnace flue is going the right direction, or to test the plugs with his little light thing that he has. I don't even know what the names of the tools are. But my point is that I don't need to see it because I'm not the professional. I'm an expert, or my skill is finding the deal, funding the deal, running the numbers, and identifying it as a deal. That's what I bring to the table as value. Then I hire the rest out, Same
exact for me.
It's so funny that you are next door to your unit there and you're like, no, I'm not walking over there. I'm going to call my plumber and he's going to do it. I'm busy doing whatever else. I'm finding the next deal. That's the mentality that you have to have. The old mentality of like, what if the toilet breaks? That's such like a mom and pop landlord style. Like it's just kind of an outdated process. Like we don't need to do it that way anymore. If you're buying deals that have the cash flow to support the maintenance and to support paying people to help you, then have people help you. It's funny how people make it such a big thing when it's like, oh, well, you can't go see it. Like you can't take care of it. I was just talking to a guy the other day on the phone. I'm like, yeah. He's like, how's your real estate stuff going? I'm like, yeah, I got a bunch of properties out in Ohio. And he's like, well, man, you should buy some, locally so you can manage them. And I'm like, I don't want to manage them.
I do manage mine.
Yeah.
And they're 2,000 miles away. I do manage mine personally. I don't have a property manager. Yeah, so you can do it even from thousands of miles away.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's just a matter of having the team in place, like whatever. It definitely can be done. And
it's just it's an old reputation that real estate has, and it hasn't been able to shake it yet. And eventually technology, it'll catch up and people will realize that technology has completely changed it, and it'll eventually change. But for now, it's just an old reputation that's stuck with real estate.
Yeah. We have people from China buying houses in California to rent them out. Like it can be done. Yep, exactly. I love it. And so it's just funny because I think that would be people. And I think I've already said it a couple times on this episode. Like you have to identify the assumptions or the fear that's keeping you from making moves and dive into why you're having that fear. And I bet you it's on some assumption or some miscalculated data point that's not correct or fabricated in your own mind, right? Or you feel that way because you haven't read enough. You haven't discovered that there's ways to do this. I mean, there's David Long's book on long distance real estate investing. It will take care of all the unknowns that you have about long distance real estate investing. And then if you read that book, you'll feel way better out of it because the unknowns will now be knowns, and you'll have a process and more data around making that decision. So if you're fearful, learn and challenge the assumptions that you're making and just take that leap. Anybody can do it, like you said.
Absolutely.
So why are you doing this? Like, what's your why in real estate investing right now?
To generate enough passive income that I don't have to do anything that I don't want to do. Originally, I thought I wanted to own thousands and thousands of units, but that goal has changed for me over the years. I'd rather own 10 units that I own myself or with a business partner and have more cash flow than owning 1,000 units and having a job that I have to manage all of that. So I'd rather keep it a relatively small portfolio that's high cash flow. And, I'm honored and humbled to be able to have left the corporate world actually on my 26th birthday just a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
To pursue real estate and my podcast full time. But that's the goal is to have enough passive income coming in every month that I can do that and only that if I want, or I can work on basically anything I want to do. I can spend my time doing what I want to do.
Yeah. That's awesome. And it sounds like you, and I've had this thought just recently too, like it sounds like you became more focused on building the life that you wanted, not necessarily building a real estate business.
Absolutely.
And I think people get caught up in that sometimes. They're so desperate for the financial independence that they'll build a real estate investing business or a wholesaling business. And then they're like, oh, well, I just have a different job now and I'm in charge of it. So there's some more freedom there, but it's just another thing. Like you have to be careful. If you're going to go build a business, make sure you build a life that the business fits into, not go build a business and then try and fit your life into the business, if that makes sense. Like, because some people, they go out and they build this big business and then they're wondering like why they don't have the life that they want. And I'm like, well, why would you ever build a business that didn't harmonize with the life that you wanted? I think we have to be very careful with that. Otherwise, you might leave one job for a different job that you still don't like because it takes too much time or it's too much obligation. So I don't know. Does that make sense? Did you kind of go through that thought process when you kind of made that shift?
Yeah, I would argue it's still a business, but I'm designing the business to operate in a way that I have freedom still. I'm not looking to build another job. I'm looking to build a business that I can be hands off. And I would argue you don't have a business if you don't have some sort of freedom from it. I would just argue you have a job. And so it's what do you prefer? Yeah,
I agree. That's awesome. So tell us a little bit more about the podcast, the platform that you have. What's kind of the messaging and what's the platform about?
My goal is to help people invest their time and money better. That is number one goal. I have one podcast, but it has two segments. One segment is called Millennial Investing. It's focused on helping 20 to 40-year-olds invest in the stock market typically and get a handle on their personal finances. And then the second segment of the show comes out on Wednesdays. That is called Real Estate 101. We talk about all aspects of real estate, typically trying to help new era investors get their first, second, third, basically up to probably 5 or 6 deals or so is really what we're trying to focus on.
Love that. That's awesome. Well, this has been a super good conversation. I've learned a lot. It's been good to talk about the long distance stuff. And the house hacking. It's been good for me to hear some of these stories, some of your expertise. Where, if people want to find you, if people want to message you, contact you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I would say the best two places are I host a community. It's called the REI Shadow. So I created this community to allow people to shadow me on my real estate journey. It's kind of like a mastermind, but rather they get to shadow me on everything I'm doing. So every single thing that happens in my real estate business, in my real estate portfolio, I share every single detail with the people that are part of this community. And so if I get a text from my business partner, from my agents, from my lenders, anything, I take a screenshot of it put it in the community. So everybody has the details. What's great about books is it gives you the theory and the process on what you need to do. But a lot of people have questions about the nitty gritty, the actual steps that are happening in real transactions. I just bought 3 deals last month and I walked everybody in this community through every single step, every single email, everything that had to be done to acquire these properties. It removes all the questions people have about actually purchasing a deal. So that's probably the best place. You can find that at thereishadow.com, or you can just connect with me on Instagram. The best way to reach me is just shoot me a DM. My username is @Leonard.
Perfect. Yeah, that's huge. I mean, the books can only go so far. They're going to kind of give you the roadmap, but ultimately seeing the deals go down and seeing the details, that's what fills in the blank spots on the map, or the more details, right? That's how you
so
really
I bought a Burr property recently, and one of the, you get to explain the Burr process through these books, and that's awesome, and the podcast. But what you don't see is you bought this property and you got to wait 3 to 5 weeks typically for renovations, and then it gets rented out. You probably don't think about the grass growing. So our agent went by the other day and he's like, the grass is up to my waist. We need to get this cut. And it's so I put a message in there. So people now know, okay, if you're buying this property and you have a little bit of vacancy before you get a tenant in there, one of the things you have to take into consideration is mowing the grass. It's just one of these small little nitty gritty details that most people don't think of or get from podcasts and books that I'm able to share with the community.
Yeah, love that. Perfect. Parting question, parting advice. I'll ask, what's the characteristic or the mindset characteristic that you see in the people that succeed versus the people that struggle to reach their goals and succeed in real estate?
Confidence. Just realizing that they can do it. That's all you need. All you need is the belief in yourself that you could do it.
Love that. That's awesome. Well, Robert, thank you so much for being on. I appreciate it. We will definitely have those the ways to get a hold of you in the notes here. And I'm excited to check out that report. That's going to be super helpful, man. Appreciate your time, man. You have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Money Maven Project podcast. A true Maven shares knowledge with others. So be sure to share this podcast and leave a review. Thanks so much. And until next time, live life with intention.